of him until June and tap into the resource that he clearly has made available to the Department of Interior. And with that, we stand adjourned. Thank you.
We now take you to the Senate. They'll have 30 minutes of general speeches and then recess for a joint meeting to hear from the South Korean president. That'll happen at 10:30 Eastern. You can see that meeting live on our companion network, C-SPAN. Now live coverage of the Senate on C-SPAN 2.
Almighty hand leads forth in beauty all the starry band. Thank you for the gift of freedom that you have given our nation. Make us responsible stewards of your bounty. Guide our lawmakers in the way of peace as your liberating love is seen in their lives. Lord, give them tough faith for troubled times. May they submit to your guidance and strive to faithfully serve you. Give them the serenity to accept the things they cannot change, the courage to change the things they can, and the wisdom to know the difference. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Pledge of
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 8, 2013. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable William M. Cowan, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President, I am told S-888 is the desk and due for its second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S-888, a bill to provide end-user exemptions from certain provisions of the Commodity Exchange Act and the Security Exchange Act of 1934.
Mr. President, I object to any further proceedings with respect to this bill.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
For years, Republicans have been singing the praises of regular order. Week after week, month after month, it has gone into years now. Even though that may have been not correct, they did it anyway. They said how they missed the days of committee markups, how they longed for amendment vote-a-rama, amendments, and how they pined for a budget resolution. As a junior senator from Texas said just before the election, and this is a quote, Senate Democrats have not even had a budget in 3 years. They are not pretending to try to fix those problems. I think that's irresponsible. End of quote. But then Republicans got what they wanted. 46 days ago, Mr. President, 46 days it's been since the Senate passed its budget. But Republicans are standing in the way of moving forward in the conference. They got what they asked, but now they no longer want what they asked for. Remember, Mr. President, 46 days ago, under regular order, after a thorough committee markup, all-night session, we ended at 5 a.m. in the morning, the Senate passed a budget resolution. So over the last 46 days, Republicans have stunningly and repeatedly blocked attempts to name budget conferees. And we did that, we could start down the path to compromise. You know, that's what legislation is all about. Legislation, by definition, is the art of compromise. Now it's Republicans who, as Senator Cruz put it, aren't even pretending to fix these problems. Mr. President, as Republicans often said, the regular order of the budget process is the only way to get long-term, sound fiscal policy. Democrats and Republicans won't find common ground if they don't sit down and talk. And obviously, I guess you can talk to yourself. It doesn't do any good. We need someone to talk to. And here's what we're trying to accomplish. Move legislation forward. But, Mr. President, don't take my word for it. Listen to what the Speaker of the House of Representatives said just a few weeks ago. Quote, here is the process. The House passes a bill. The Senate passes a bill. And if we disagree, we can go to conference and work it out. End of quote. So what Speaker Boehner and Senator Cruz have said is that they, I guess, used to love the idea of regular order. They don't like it anymore. They got what they wanted, but they don't like what they got. This is what my friend the minority leader said in January of this year. In praise of conference committee, here's what he said, quote, if the Senate version is different than the one the House sends over, send it off to conference. That's how things are supposed to work around here. We used to call it legislating. That's what the Republican leader said. A few days later, Senator McConnell extolled the virtue of regular order, saying this, and I quote, remember, regular order is how the Senate is supposed to function. The public is supposed to have a chance to scrutinize the proposals before us. So here we have it, Mr. President. We have the junior senator from Texas, the Speaker of the House, and the Republican leader saying we should have regular order. We should pass legislation, as we've done, as the House has done, and then work it out in conference. So we agree, I agree with those three senators. And you know something else, the American public agrees. But they suddenly don't like what they wish for. We passed our budget. Republicans passed theirs. The next step under regular order is to move to conference to negotiate a compromise. I can't understand. Well, maybe I do. I think I understand why Republicans don't want to debate their budget in the light of day. You see, the Ryan budget, which they extol to each other, passed the House, and it would turn Medicare into a voucher program, ending Medicare as we know it. The Ryan Republican budget would lower taxes for the rich, while the middle class foots the bill. That's in their budget. And the Republican budget would rip the safety net from under the elderly, the middle class, veterans, and the poor. So no wonder they don't want to go to conference. No wonder they don't want transparency. The Democratic budget, by contrast, would preserve and protect Medicare for our children and our grandchildren. The Democratic budget would ask the wealthiest Americans to contribute just a little bit more to help reduce the deficit. The Democratic budget would balance smart spending cuts with new revenue from closing loopholes. It's obvious then why Republicans don't want to compare the sensible Republican budget with the extreme House budget. You know, Mr. President, the extreme House Republican budget was resoundingly rejected by the voters in November. That's what Governor Romney touted. Remember, Congressman Ryan was his vice presidential candidate. They ran together. So now it's time for each side to stand for what it believes. As a junior senator from Texas said late last year, quote, we've got to go on record and say, this is what we want to do, this is our budget, end of quote, direct quote. Democrats aren't afraid to debate our principles in the light of day. We aren't afraid to try to resolve our differences in a conference committee instead of behind closed doors. This has been the custom in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives for more than 200 years. Why are the Republicans so afraid? Why are they blocking us from continuing this process in public? We heard from the junior senator from Texas. The Republicans will only go to conference if Democrats agree ahead of time to give in to every one of their demands. Now that's a strange one. Sure, we'll go to conference, but before we go, you have to agree to everything we want. If Republicans can't rig the game in their favor, he said, there'll be no game, no conference, no legislating at all. Democrats want to put deadline day negotiations and last-minute fixes behind us. We want to engage in a responsible legislative process under regular order. And we'll keep pushing the process forward. Passing a budget in each chamber is a good step toward restoring regular order. But it's only the first step. The next move is to sit down and resolve our differences. Mr. President, following remarks of my remarks and those of Senator McConnell, the Senate will be in morning business till 10 a.m. today. At 10 a.m., the Senate will recess until 11:30 to allow for a joint meeting of Congress with the President of the Republic of South Korea. When the Senate reconvenes, we'll resume consideration of S-601, the Water Resources Development Act. At 2 p.m., there will be 3 roll call votes in relation to the amendments to the bill.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Later today, we'll welcome the President of South Korea to address both houses of Congress. President Park is a truly extraordinary woman, the first female chief executive of her country, and I might add, a conservative. She's a strong leader, too. I presume that's because she's endured so much in her own life. The assassination of her mother when she was only 22. The assassination of her father a few years after that, and the violent attack she herself endured in 2006. And yet, beyond a scar on her face, you'd never have known it. She didn't recoil in fear. She threw herself right back into the rough and tumble of public life. So she's tough. And I know this tenacious leader is committed to the U.S.-Korea alliance, which is so important to both of our countries. The transition from her predecessor, President Lee, could not have been smoother. Both his administration and hers have been true partners, especially in a time of heightened tension. So we welcome President Park and look forward to hearing what she has to say later today. Now, on an entirely different matter, Mr. President, this morning I'd like to say a few words about the nomination of Thomas Perez as Labor Secretary. The Perez nomination has generated a fair amount of controversy. For those who haven't tuned in yet to the debate surrounding his nomination, I'd like to take a few minutes this morning to explain why. The first thing to say about this nomination is that neither I nor anyone else on this side of the aisle has anything against Mr. Perez personally. As a graduate of Harvard Law School, there are a lot of things he could have done other than advocate for those struggling on the fringes of our society. And yet, when it comes to a vote like this, we have to weigh a lot more than a nominee's intentions. We have to look at how those intentions square with the higher obligation that any nominee, but especially a cabinet nominee, has to the rule of law. And it's on this point where this nomination becomes so controversial, and where the deference that senators of both parties generally grant presidents when it comes to picking cabinet nominees begins to break down. Because by all accounts, Tom Perez is not just a man with a heart for the poor. He is a committed ideologue who appears willing, quite frankly, to say or do anything to achieve his ideological ends. His willingness, time and again, to bend or ignore the law and to misstate the facts in order to advance his far-left ideology lead me and others to conclude that he'd continue to do so if he were confirmed to another and much more consequential position of public trust. Take, for instance, his efforts while on the Montgomery County Council to get Canadian drugs imported to the U.S. According to the Washington Post, Perez tried to get the county to import these drugs even after a top FDA official said doing so would be, in his words, quote, undeniably illegal, end quote. What was Perez's response? Federal law is muddled, he said at the time. Sometimes you have to push the envelope. Think about that statement. Sometimes you have to push the envelope. Is that the kind of approach to federal law we want in those we confirm to run federal agencies? Folks who think that if the federal law is inconvenient to their ends, they can simply characterize it as unclear and use that as an excuse to do whatever they want? If that's not a red flag for those of us who have to review a presidential nominee, I don't know what is. Now again, someone might say that everybody in politics has to make judgments about how a given law is to be interpreted. Those who disagree with those judgments call it pushing the envelope. Mr. Perez, however, does not merely push the envelope. All too often he circumvents or ignores a law with which he disagrees. Here are a few examples. As a member of the Montgomery County Council, Mr. Perez pushed through a county policy that encouraged the circumvention of federal immigration law. Later, as head of the federal government's top voting rights watchdog, he refused to protect the right to vote for Americans of all races in violation of the very law he was charged to enforce. In the same post at the Department of Justice, Perez directed the federal government to sue against the advice of career attorneys in his own office. In another case involving a Florida woman who was lawfully exercising her First Amendment right to protest in front of an abortion clinic, the federal judge who threw out Mr. Perez's lawsuit said he was, quote, at a loss as to why the government chose to prosecute this particular case, end quote, in the first place. This is what pushing the envelope means in the case of Mr. Perez. A flippant and dismissive attitude about the boundaries that everyone else has to follow for the sake of the liberal causes he believes in. In short, it means a lack of respect for the rule of law and a lack of respect for the need of those in positions of power to follow it. Just as troubling, however, is the fact that Mr. Perez has been called to account for his failures to follow the law. He's been less than forthright about his actions when called to account. When he testified that politics played no role in his office decision not to pursue charges against members of a far-left group who may have tried to prevent others from voting, for instance, the department's own watchdog said that, quote, Perez's testimony did not reflect the entire story, end quote. And a federal judge said that the evidence before him, quote, appeared to contradict Perez's testimony, end quote. Perez has also made misleading statements about this case under oath to Congress and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Mr. Perez's involvement in an alleged quid pro quo deal with the city of St. Paul, Minnesota also fits the pattern. Here was a case where Perez was allegedly so concerned about a potential Supreme Court challenge to the legality of a theory he championed in housing discrimination suits known as, quote, disparate impact, end quote, that he quietly worked out a deal with St. Paul officials whereby they'd withdraw their appeal to the Supreme Court of the disparate impact case if he arranged for the federal government to throw out 2 whistleblower complaints against St. Paul that could have recovered millions of dollars for the taxpayers that had been falsely obtained. In the end, the 2 whistleblowers' complaints were dropped, and the Supreme Court never heard the disparate impact case. Perez has told investigators he hadn't even heard of the disparate impact case until the court initially decided to hear it. But that's been contradicted by HUD Deputy Assistant Secretary Sarah Pratt, who told investigators she and Perez discussed the case well before that. Taken together, all of this paints the picture, for me at least, not of a passionate liberal who sees himself as patiently operating within the system and through the democratic process to advance a particular set of strongly held beliefs, but a crusading ideologue whose conviction about his own rightness on the issues leads him to believe the law does not apply to him. Unbound by the rules that apply to everyone else, Perez seems to view himself as free to employ whatever means at his disposal, legal or otherwise, to achieve his ideological goals. To say this is problematic would be an understatement. As Secretary of Labor, Perez would be handling numerous contentious issues and implementing many politically sensitive laws, including laws enforcing the disclosure of political activity by labor unions. Mr. Perez's devotion to the cause of involuntary universal voter registration is also deeply concerning to me personally, and I would imagine many of my colleagues in the Senate also believe in the absolute centrality of maintaining the integrity of the vote. Americans of all political persuasions have a right to expect that the head of such a sensitive federal department, whether appointed by a Republican or a Democrat, will implement and follow the law in a fair and reasonable way. I do not believe they could expect as much from Mr. Perez. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 10 a.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, and with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees.
Mr. President.
The senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, on July 1st, the interest rate on new federally subsidized student loans is set to double from 3.4 to 6.8%. That means unless Congress acts, for millions of young people, the cost of borrowing money to go to college will double. The student debt problem in this country is a quiet but growing problem. Today's graduates carry more than $1 trillion in debt, more than all the outstanding credit card debt in the whole country. Doubling interest rates on new student loans will just increase pressure on our young people. Now, keep in mind, these young people didn't go to the mall and run up charges on a credit card. They worked hard, they stayed in class, they learned new skills, and they borrowed what they needed to pay for an education. Their education will improve their opportunities in life, but their education won't just help those students. When they acquire more skills, these students will help us build a strong and competitive economy. They will strengthen our middle class. Student interest rates are set to double in less than 2 months, but so far Congress has done nothing to address this problem. Now, some people say we can't afford to help our kids through school by keeping student interest rates low. But right now, as I speak, the federal government offers far lower interest rates on loans every single day. They just don't do it for everyone. Right now, a big bank can get a loan through the Federal Reserve discount window at a rate of about 0.75%. But this summer, a student who's trying to get a loan to go to college will pay almost 7%. In other words, the federal government is going to charge interest rates 9 times higher than the rates they charge the biggest banks, the same banks that destroyed millions of jobs and nearly broke the economy. That isn't right. And that's why I'm introducing legislation today to give students the same deal we give to the big banks. The Bank on Students Loan Fairness Act would allow students who are eligible for federally subsidized Stafford loans to borrow at the same rate that the big banks get through the Federal Reserve discount window. For 1 year, the Federal Reserve would make funds available to the Department of Education to make loans to students at the same low rates offered to the big banks. This will give students relief from high interest rates while giving Congress a chance to find a long-term solution. Now, some may say, we can't afford this proposal. I would remind them that the federal government currently makes 36 cents in profit for every dollar that it lends to students. Add up those profits and you'll find that next year student loans will bring in $34 billion. Meanwhile, the banks pay interest that is 1/9 the amount that students will be asked to pay. That's just wrong. It doesn't reflect our values. We shouldn't be profiting from our students who are drowning in debt while we're giving a great deal to the big banks. We should be investing in our young people so they can get good jobs and grow the economy. So let's give them the same great deal that the banks get. Now, some explain that the banks get exceptionally low interest rates because the economy is still shaky and banks need access to cheap credit to continue the recovery. But our students are just as important to the economic recovery as our banks, and the debt they carry poses a serious risk to that recovery. In fact, in March of this year, the Federal Reserve said that because of the economic impact on family budgets, high levels of student debt pose a risk to our shaky economic recovery. If the Federal Reserve can float trillions of dollars to large financial institutions at low interest rates to grow the economy, surely they can float the Department of Education the money to fund our students, keep us competitive, and help grow our middle class. Let's face it, banks get a great deal when they borrow money from the Fed. In effect, the American taxpayer is investing in those banks. We should make the same kind of investment in our young people who are trying to get an education. Lend them the money, make them pay it back, but give our kids a break on the interest they pay. Let's bank on students. The Bank on Students Loan Fairness Act is my first standalone bill in the United States Senate. I'm introducing this bill because our students are facing a crisis. We cannot stand by and simply watch. This is about our students, our economy, and our values. The Bank on Students Loan Fairness Act is a first step toward helping young people who are drowning in debt. Unlike the big banks, students don't have armies of lobbyists and lawyers. They have only their voices, and they call on us to do what is right. Thank you.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 11:30 a.m. for the joint meeting.
The Senate's now recessed to allow members to head over to the House chambers for remarks from South Korean President Park Geun-hye. You can see her remarks live at 10:30 Eastern on our companion network, C-SPAN. The Senate will return at 11:30 for continued work on a water infrastructure bill authorizing dozens of projects